Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today, both online and in person, for this very exciting project launch and panel discussion on lessons and implications of military withdrawal in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. My name is Caroline Rose, and I'm the director of the newly launched Post-Withdrawal Security Landscapes Project as part of the Strategic Blind Spots portfolio here at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. This project seeks to address the concept of what constitutes a responsible, partial, or full-scale withdrawal, drawing lessons from case studies such as Afghanistan amidst calls for a reduced U.S. forward presence in the Middle East. The project will explore strategic, operational, and tactical elements and risks of military withdrawal, assessing conflict security landscapes and identifying the blind spots that could jeopardize the drawdown processes and challenge U.S. strategic interests abroad. Today, to kick off this project, I'm joined by four distinguished experts and analysts on case studies in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. Before we jump into this discussion, I do want to take a moment to introduce them and boast a bit about their accomplishments. First, we have Mr. Jonathan Lord, a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at CNAS. Prior to joining CNAS, Lord served as a professional staff member of the House Armed Services Committee, serving the full committee and managing the U.S. Central Command and Middle East Defense Policy portfolio, as well as issues related to security assistance. Lord previously served as the Iraq country director at the Office of the Undersecretary for Defense Policy and as a political military analyst at the U.S. Department of Defense. At the request of the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Lord served as the political officer during two temporary detail assignments at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad in 2018. He also previously worked in support of the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of Infrastructure Protection. Thanks so much for being with us here today, Mr. Lord. Then we also have Ms. Kate Bateman, a senior expert on Afghanistan for the U.S. Institute of Peace. Previously, Bateman was a project lead in Lessons Learned program at the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan and Reconstruction, where she led reports on anti-corruption, counter-narcotics, the integration of ex-combatants, and gender equality. From 2016 to 2017, as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow at the Center for New American Security, Bateman researched and wrote on corruption as a national security issue. She has also served in intelligence and policy positions at the State Department here in Washington, D.C. We're also happy to have newly retired Colonel Miles Cagdin III with us, a senior non-resident fellow here at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, and the recent co-author of a post-withdrawal security landscape project report, preparing for withdrawal from Syria, building immigration program for U.S. partners of Operation Inherent Resolve, which you can all grab a copy of here in the office. Colonel Kagan served as the U.S. Army's visiting fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and served a 3-year-long combat tours in Iraq, and as the former spokesman for the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, where he led a multinational communication team representing over 78 nations. Colonel Kagan provides expertise on public information warfare, ISIS, Kurdish affairs, and veterans issues and national security. He is also the founder and CEO of Words Warriors, a translation, public relations, and business advising company with offices here in Washington, D.C., in New York City and Urbio, Illinois. And last but not least, we have Ms. Carolyn Moorman, an analyst and content coordinator here at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy and Post-Withdrawal Security Landscapes Project. She is also the co-author of the recent report that I just mentioned. Her research focuses on non-state actors in the Middle East, as well as Central and West Africa. Previously, Carolyn conducted research at the American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project and the Institute for the Study of War. She previously assisted Dr. Nathan French of Miami University's Department of Comparative Religion with his research on Salafi jihadism and interned at the Heritage Foundation and the U.S. Embassy of Luxembourg. With that, I would like to jump into questions. For our audience members, please note that this discussion is indeed on the record, and we will be reserving time at the end for questions for our panelists. Before we discuss specific cases of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, I'd like to pose an initial question to you all. We're convening this event at a time when the United States is seeking to shift its security priorities towards the Pacific and European theaters against Russia and China. But also we're facing the potential for resurgence of conflict in the Middle East due to escalation and potential violence spillover in Gaza. What do you forecast as the U.S. defensive priority in the Middle East and prospect for full, partial, or even no withdrawal? And we'll go from this side down.
Thanks. Good afternoon. It's an honor to share a panel with such distinguished researchers and practitioners. And Carol, I commend you for leading this program for New Lines about withdrawals. And these are strategic withdrawals, but sometimes they're hasty withdrawals, but they always have strategic implications. Any day on the news, on the front page, on the back page and center pages, we see that our world is on the brink. Conflicts in the Middle East, conflicts in Europe with Russia and Ukraine. Also in the global south, we have unrest in sub-Saharan Africa, in Central Africa. Here, closer to America, we still have narco state on our southern border, as well as governments that are challenged in Haiti and other areas. So the United States and the president has many balls to juggle with America's foreign policy, but America has learned over time that what America wants, America doesn't always get, and the outcomes that we might think might happen in Washington aren't always coming to fruition, and if they do, it's not in the timeline that we want. So where are we in? We're in a place where there are competing priorities. We saw our national security advisor have an article in Foreign Affairs magazine that indicated that the Middle East was more stable than it has been, and then a week later, we had the situation between Hamas and Israel. And it has caused now a place where nations have their own votes at the United Nations, and we see that the world is watching the situation in Palestine and Israel with close attention, and that there are actors, state and non-state actors, who are forcing the hand of the President of the United States to make some decisions about where we prioritize our efforts militarily, and also Congress is making resourcing decisions. So that whole wind-up to say we don't know where things are going in the world, but as part of our discussion today, there are some warnings and indicators that the U.S. will be making decisions about our presence of troops in the Middle East, both short-term and long-term. And the primary influence of those decisions will be American politics and political cycles.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and privilege to be speaking here with these distinguished panelists, and thank you to the audience for their interest. In response to your question, I think the two immediate security and strategic threats that we face in the greater Middle East are preventing a wider war spilling out of the Israeli-Palestinian or the Israeli-Hamas conflict right now, and as well as our ongoing counterterrorism interests. And given the focus of the last few weeks and the trend towards strategic competition, and the policy bandwidth has really shifted to the threats of Russia, China, and implications of that around the world, it's important to not lose sight of these ongoing terrorism threats in the region and consequently for U.S. interests over the short and long term. So I would say I was looking at there's testimony at the end of October by the director for the National Counterterrorism Center, Christine Abizaid, and she told the Senate that that NCTC is watching Al Qaeda, the Al Qaeda affiliate in Yemen, ISIS branch in Afghanistan, as well as Al Qaeda and ISIS affiliates in West and East Africa, and the concerns are heightened about those groups. Although on the positive side, we've seen a reduced threat of terrorism in the region over the last few years. So there's some good news, but I think it would, if we turned away from those threats, it would be at our peril. So really requires vigilance and monitoring, and particularly preventing a spillover effect of the recent attacks by Hamas.
Thanks for having me, Caroline. This is a great event. It's a great report. This is the first thing I've ever been to where I get my own personalized talk. But I kind of wanted to start by agreeing with Miles. There seems to be this trend where ultimately wars or U.S. Military engagements and because of political decisions, and it's absolutely been proven out to be the case. Afghanistan, obviously, the most recent and brazen example of the decision fundamentally to leave, irrespective of whatever truths existed on or off the ground. I think it's possible looking ahead to Syria and Iraq, not today, not tomorrow, but eventually, whether it be the Congress or a president will make the decision to take us out of Iraq and or Syria. We start to see it a little bit on the margins of Congress in the political dialogue from both the left and the right, questioning what our purpose is there, both the authorities, both what the provenance of the mission is. I do think, and this is probably not my expertise, speaking of Afghanistan, but I do think there are probably some concerning echoes in both the Pentagon, in civilian leadership, irrespective of administration, and then of course on the military leadership, falling down on the job. Whereas it is very difficult to discern what is the strategic objective that is being marched towards at this point. There's been a history of mission creep over time, where the tasks and activities that are inherited by every new commander and command team that comes in seems to grow increasingly divorced from the original objectives, and the mission doesn't update to reflect either successes or failures, and there isn't a constant strategic refresh of what is going on to ensure success, nor is there clearly a defined idea of what success looks like. And I think that's particularly true of Syria, and then it will impede upon what we think of what right looks like for Iraq. I think we're sort of stuck in this place, and that was, of course, I could have made that argument a year ago or 2 years ago, and I've argued, I wrote a piece in Law there on the 20th anniversary of OIF, I wrote a piece in The Economist. This administration has done a lot of great work in the Middle East. One place where I think there's been a blind spot is the focus on Iraq and Syria. Rutherford gave a speech at Atlantic Council on the Biden doctrine earlier this year, talk about aid that was going to Syria for the earthquake. There really wasn't any discussion about U.S. policy in Iraq and Syria moving forward. I think it's sort of been in this frozen state. And ultimately, the problem with that is that it does lead to this political blowback over time. Pressure will build and eventually sort of explode, whereby politics will demand we leave. And because we have not been actively thinking through and working on the problem, whatever is left behind ultimately will be unsustainable. We haven't updated the mission, and I think there's a lot to be done before we leave.
First of all, I'd like to thank Caroline and the Wise Institute for this wonderful event. I'm very honored to be speaking on this panel with the other great and distinguished guests. I think that the panelists have laid out really great points about concerns that the U.S. has for its defense priorities in the Middle East. And I would say in terms of the current Israeli-Hamas conflict, the worry about escalation in terms of the leader with Iran is a concern. We've seen a very, very large amount of attacks by Iranian affiliated forces on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, and the threat of this playing into kind of how U.S. public opinion looks at U.S. force posture in Iraq and Syria, and the threat of U.S. forces being targeted and hurt and injured is very real and concerning. And as far as the politicization of this decision, I think it would be optimistic and a little too optimistic to say that the U.S. has learned all the lessons it needs to from the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, and even the Trump administration's decision to reorient forces in Syria and the ramifications of that in 2019. But I don't think we have, and I think that only made it more important because this next coming election cycle will really going to play into the withdrawal conversation.
So I think that we've set the scene of U.S. strategic priorities in the Middle East, how they're panning out, the issue of mission creep, also the challenge of trying to further define Operation Inherent Resolve, particularly amidst skepticism and also increased attention on U.S. defensive positions in Iraq and Syria amidst these tit-for-tat strikes between Iran-aligned militias under the PMF and U.S. forces. But the elephant in the room here, of course, is Afghanistan. When we talk about the potential or the risk of withdrawal in either Iraq or Syria, partial withdrawal or full withdrawal, there is the question of what sorts of lessons learned could be incorporated for a responsible withdrawal process, if that is inevitable, if that is deemed inevitable. And I want to turn to you, Ms. Bateman. You've conducted extensive work on the implications of the U.S. decision-making process for withdrawal in Afghanistan, identifying the strategic, operational, tactical elements in which the withdrawal process was conducted. What sorts of lessons learned can this case bring about when we're talking about Syria? What sort of blind spots do we need to incorporate into that case?
Thank you. It's a great question. In my answer, I'd like to distinguish between the decision to withdraw and the execution of the withdrawal. I think we can go down a very big rabbit hole debating the wisdom of the decision, and that's a good debate, a valid debate on its own merit. But I'm going to focus more on the execution, on the how, but also the strategic context, because while I'd argue we need to distinguish those, you also can't analyze the execution without really thinking about the nature of the decision itself and the reason and the strategic context of it. So I'm going to ask us all to put on our graduate school hats and remember Clausewitz and the 4 levels of war, which are tactical, operational, strategic, and some would add a 4th, political. And I'd like to talk about potential lessons we can take at the political strategic level and at the tactical operational level. I think it's worth thinking through in this project the New Lines is embarking on, what decisions or actions fall where, at what level of war, and what was the thinking or the lack of thinking at the strategic or political level that then affected, the execution at lower levels. In Afghanistan, the context is that in February 2020, well, of course, depends on how long do you want to go back in telling the story, right? But February 2020, the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, and that was signed without the involvement of the Afghan government, of the Republic government. And that agreement provided for a condition-phased timeline for U.S. forces withdrawal, as well as foreign forces and contractors. That was in the text of the agreement. And meanwhile, on the Taliban side, they committed to essentially to ceasing attacks against U.S. forces, and there were some secret annexes about other agreements in terms of security operations. But the Taliban essentially, as my colleague Dipali Mukhopadhyay, she testified yesterday at a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, and I commend that hearing to everyone to watch. But Dipali said, quote, "The Doha Agreement satisfied the minimum demands of the U.S. and the maximum demands of the Taliban." So you already had a political agreement that massively favored essentially and legitimized the Taliban. Why? Because we had almost no military leverage. The U.S. had very little leverage to the point that it was negotiating that agreement. We can talk more about, why did the U.S. fail to use its military leverage over 20 years to achieve a more lasting political settlement in Afghanistan? That's a larger issue. But another witness at that hearing yesterday, General Sami Sadat, who's a highly decorated Afghan army general, and he said after the Doha Agreement, politically we could never recover. We, meaning the Afghan government and security forces. So I share those quotes to highlight that there are political consequences of U.S. forces' presence in the country. There are not only security implications, of course, and those the political import of our presence then has in turn security consequences. And in Afghanistan, U.S. troops symbolized American commitment to the project of the Afghan state we've spent 20 years building. It's also symbolized U.S. confidence in the Afghan government and their security forces. And so at the strategic level, the trend for years was a drastic decline in U.S. forces, of course. So by the time you get to 2021, we've gone from a maximum of 100,000 U.S. forces in country to nearly 2,500. And they were not in a combat role anymore. So this signaled to Afghan forces and to the civilian government that the U.S. was not in it for the long haul, right? So already the environment, the strategic environment at the time was really demoralizing for Afghan forces. And when we look at the dramatic collapse of Afghan security forces over the, particularly between April 2021 when Biden announced the withdrawal, which was set to happen by September 11th, between April and August 15th when Kabul fell. You look at the morale, the dramatic collapse of Afghan forces, you can consider both capability and morale, right? But one of the critical lessons here is that the U.S., in our assessments of how long those forces would stand up, we really failed to appreciate the degree to which morale and their will to fight would have consequences for the outcome, right? We assumed that because they could, we assumed that because we've given them everything, which is inaccurate in itself, but we assumed that because they had all this capacity, they would fight. But politically, the signal was that we were beating an exit. We were beating the odds of the exits. And I also wanted to just highlight the capacity of those forces largely depended on those contractors whom we decided to withdraw, again, in deference to Taliban demand. And what did that mean at the operational and tactical level? The Taliban, there's a reason the Taliban wanted this contractors withdrawal to be part of the Doha agreement. The contractors were critical to the operation and maintenance of Afghan security forces. We also, on the U.S. side, we really failed to appreciate that dynamic. And then finally, just a point on the civilian leadership side, the U.S. government also gave very mixed messages to Afghan political leaders about our intentions. And there was some in Congress and in the Security Council, particularly Trump, who had reason to believe, despite side anxiety, desire to just talk about Afghanistan. He didn't make that call. So there were U.S. high-level U.S. officials giving Afghan leaders signals that we were committed to staying, and this really led then with Biden's announcement in April 2021. That really led to a that the Americans were there to stay. It's not there.
Well, thank you. I think it's extremely important to think about the political decision to withdraw versus, of course, the process, which I think is extremely important. And on that note, I want to turn to Mr. Lord. You served as the Iraq Country Director at the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and also as a military analyst at the Department of Defense, particularly when the United States was conducting a series of base transfers and partial withdrawal within the country. Also, of course, during these kind of exchange tit for tat strikes between U.S. forces. Coincidentally, this was also when you, Colonel Kagan, were serving as the spokesman for Operation Inherent Resolve and the global coalition to defeat ISIS. With that in mind, and having witnessed the United States partial withdrawal effort in Iraq, are there any lessons learned there that could additionally inform a withdrawal process, also potentially inform the risks of further withdrawal in Iraq, especially after the United States has altered its mandate and mission from a combat to an advisory role?
First of all, call me Jonathan. Second of all, I'm here, Mr. Lord, I'm trying to with my father. Second of all, I was just coming out by saying I was actually in the department 2017, 2018, so a little bit before the timeline that you're speaking of. Otherwise, on the Hill doing oversight and watching all of this very closely. I can tell you from my time in the department back then, we and CENTCOM, J5 planners and coalition partners were thinking about what phase 4 of the operation looked like, what OIR next would be, ultimately trying to do all the branch planning that would inform the future of this operation once it had gotten past the combat stages. And ultimately, what occurred was something that I just never would have anticipated, is that just the combat stages were finished and we kind of just continued to drift. And ultimately, it was tactical consideration that then caused the mission to evolve. So it was actually, to my understanding, COVID played a very large role in changing the mission. No longer was there, advise and assist going on in a very tactical way there once had been, and people were basically doing their advising virtually, and that then created the conditions by which the U.S. mission and posture could change, and therefore it did. It was convenient as well that from a fourth posture and security standpoint, that of course there was the risk of COVID, and of course there was a posture risk, the force protection risk coming from militia groups as well. But ultimately, these were tactical considerations that were shaping the mission and not strategic objectives. I think we've been in a position where the strategic objectives have been in this murky place of drift for years, and even in the course of the last years of this administration, many of the political decisions are frankly just catching up to where we were on the ground. The decision to formally end the U.S. combat role in 2021 really reflected the reality of what had existed for the past 18 months. And even now, some of the discussions that have begun to occur this past year from a Pentagon to MOD level between the U.S. and Iraq about what the future mission can and should look like, ultimately are not fast enough to keep up with the pace of relevance. This is problematic for a whole host of reasons. For one, again, I mean, there is that continual political pressure over time. What are we doing there? And what are we achieving? But secondly, to be effective, the mission need evolve. We came back to Iraq in OIR with the equivalent of emergency room medicine. Immense firepower, air, the counter ISIS trained equip fund enabled the flow of massive amounts of material into the Iraqi army, support the counterterrorism service, and of course the establishment of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and all of this, say nothing of course for the Peshmerga, is incredibly expensive, but made a lot of sense when essentially ISIS is at the gates of Crimea and is almost able to range Erbil airport, and the country is, and the region is in existential threat. But over time, once the patient, and not to push this analogy too far, is out of immediate harm, how do you then evolve your support to be preventative? And this is, I think, where we've fallen down. And we, even among the US government, don't have a coherent plan to provide sustained and sustainable support such that we're building indigenous partner forces that can do this on their own, absent massive coalition enablers in US support. And even now, so much of the foreign military financing support that the US provides goes to support Iraqi systems that the Iraqis will never be able to maintain on their own. Much of the counter ISIS trained equip fund goes to pay for stipends for a nominally bipartisan Peshmerga force, which isn't particularly actually bipartisan or effective or doing all that much. And in fact, the political situation in the Kurdish region is moving in the wrong direction that would ultimately enable that force to be effective, let alone do things in a coordinated manner with the federal Iraqi government to close the ungoverned spaces where ISIS continues to find influence. These are the kinds of questions we need to answer, and then particularly the problem on the Syrian side of the border is more stark. Until we can identify a place on the strategic map to where we can actually drive the political situation, we truly are just adrift. And one of two things must be true. We either can identify what that political balance and status quo that is sustainable looks like, and we can work towards it, or we can simply understand that everything that we're doing in this country, in Syria rather, only happens under the security of US military presence and therefore is unsustainable because at some point in the future, the US military will go home. Politics that as we discussed, will demand it eventually. I can't say when. At which point, all the work that we've done in Northeast Syria will cease to exist, in my assessment, because the regional actors surrounding the partners with whom we work will no longer suffer that partner to exist in its current form, and things will revert, and space will be opened up, and ISIS will have the opportunity to recede. And if that is the reality that simply we're going to accept, one, that's a decision point we need to consider, and two, what are we doing on the Iraqi side of the border to maintain some degree of resilient sustainability such that we don't see a repeat of the breakout that occurred in 2014, and we get to do this all over again, starting at phase one, in the most painful, expensive, costly way to both men and material, as opposed to finding some sort of sustainable solution. And the fact that those conversations are not going on in an urgent way, I think is the most concerning piece.
Absolutely. And I think that something that this project has tackled and will continue to tackle is this question of the political decision, which can sometimes come on extremely quickly. We've seen political initiatives on Capitol Hill that have called for very speedy timelines for withdrawal. And once that process accrues momentum, the strategic, the broad decisions to withdraw can sometimes come and challenged because of that. I want to turn to Colonel Coggins. You were on the ground when these base transfers were being conducted, when the United States was consolidating its personnel. This was in mostly the summer of 2020. So of course there was a pandemic going on. There were a number of different challenges. What lessons learned and potentially insights did you glean while on the ground witnessing this reconsolidation process? And how did that affect the United States posture in Northeast Syria as well? We saw a lot of this consolidation in Iraq. How did that impact U.S. forward posture in Syria? And I want to throw in another question as well, drawing upon the recent report that you co-authored with Carolyn. You call for a special immigration visa program for U.S. Syria partners. Can you explain how this program could be implemented and the rationale for its adoption, despite no withdrawal decision process in Northeast Syria? Why now? Why should we start thinking about that sort of thing?
Whole range of questions, Carolyn. In addition to the report we recently published, as part of the Drawdowns program, we did a podcast interview maybe over a year ago. We talk about the process of withdrawal at the tactical level and then some of the implications that happens from that. On this topic of withdrawal, and I want to say Masao Khair and Bash to all of my contacts and their friends in northern Syria, we are not advocating for the U.S. to leave northeast Syria or abandon the partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces. What we've tried to do in our paper and our discussions here at New Lines is look at what's going to happen next. If possible, we are presenting policy options to lawmakers who are down the streets in Capitol Hill or the executive branch at the White House, as well as the interagency and Pentagon State Department. And our voice as outsiders here in the think tank, we hope to raise these discussions beyond this room, but that these will spin out into further policy discussions because these are important. When the U.S. Began its relationship and partnerships with local forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, there were visa programs created, Special Immigration Visa for local interpreters and P2 visas for others who had worked directly with U.S. coalition forces to provide an option for some of them to come to the United States. Those programs have not been well implemented, and that's what led to a lot of the debacle, disaster that happened in the final days of our withdrawal from Afghanistan. Iraq and Syria are different. The geography is different, but in Syria, there is no policy. So in Syria, America has said, at the same time America has said, we don't leave our friends behind. We have also said, except in Syria, because we don't even have a policy for you to come if there were a time, and it's sort of hand waved away by the executive branch as, well, we're in Syria to help defeat ISIS. Okay, well, what about next? Well, we don't have any plans to leave. Well, how long are you staying? Well, we're gonna be there until we're gonna be there. Okay, well, you've been attacked 55 times in the past 10 days. What does this mean? Well, we're not here to cause any problem. We're just here to fight ISIS, and we don't want those Iranian militias to attack us. These conversations happened toward the end of 2019 when I was deployed as spokesman for the coalition to defeat ISIS. October 2019, President Trump made a decision to allow Turkey to invade portions of north and east Syria to create a what's called security mechanism or so-called safe zone. President Erdogan from Turkey has presented a map at the United Nations General Assembly indicating his nation's interest in a 30-kilometer zone that goes all across the border of north and east Syria, and that is a policy of his country. The United States has seen this, thought maybe he's partially serious, so we removed forces and had our local security partners remove defensive positions along the border. That created a situation where you had terrorist groups, some radical groups, Turkish-backed groups who came in and have caused displacement and suffering of humans, assassinations of political leaders, and Turkey continues to attack into the region today. Our paper discusses these pressures on America that cause political decisions forward. Jonathan, son of Mr. Lord, mentioned earlier that there was an announcement in 2021 that the U.S. is no longer in combat operations. Well, from the onset of this, if you go and read Michael Gordon's book, The Great and Destroy, or just Google the statements made by President Obama or former White House spokesman Josh Earnest in 2015 and 16, there was never a combat. Always advising and assisting. And we've used this language, but every year we announce the end of combat operations because politically that's good for the Iraqi prime minister as they're run. And as I saw this process come into play at the end of 2019, there were attacks on the embassy by Qatar Hezbollah. There were killings of U.S. contractors. The policy of America is that we do not announce the name of U.S. contractors when they were killed, but we do mention them in statements and justification for so-called defensive strikes. But in layman's terms, they're retaliatory strikes. Where are the defensive strikes? Because we don't actually have an authorization for use of military force. There are many topics that I'm bringing up here because all of them should be addressed with policy. And in the early part of 2020, we started to hand over bases to Iraqi security forces, where U.S. had small companies. These transfers were orderly, and they were well planned and well executed, and they were legal, and each of them had a ceremony and were held in particular by the Iraqi government, as this was a sign that, one, they were successful in the campaign against ISIS, and two, that Americans and the 20 or so odd military forces that were part of the coalition were not as an occupying force. We moved out of areas in north and central Iraq, and right now, American and coalition forces are on about maybe 6-ish bases inside Iraq. Syria is a little different story. There may be around 12 to 15 small compounds that have various amounts of U.S. forces. Lessons learned from this is when there's planning and deliberate execution, there can be actions taken by local security forces to prevent rise or resurgence of terrorist groups. There is confidence from stakeholders on all sides, officials, military, governmental leaders, and when these announcements are made and action is taking place, America can continue to maintain its reputation as a leader of the world and as an entity, as a nation that is being helpful to security challenges in the Middle East and not disturbing.
So I think we got an excellent picture of the tactical and the operational side and process of partial withdrawal, particularly in the case of Iraq. Carolyn, I want to turn to you. Drawing from this recently co-authored report, you describe a changing political environment around the United States posture in Syria and Iraq. There was a recent congressional initiative that was put up this past spring that did call for a very speedy withdrawal process from Syria, for example. Can you describe some of these shifting political conditions within the United States and how that could affect withdrawal processes, either partial or full scale?
Yeah, of course. So I think it's important to first outlay this war fatigue that a lot of Americans are feeling, not just with the Russian-Ukraine war, but now in heading into this Israel-Hamas conflict. And then also this desire to match the pivot that the Biden administration has continued of the Obama and Trump administrations to Asia from the Middle East and how this is affecting force posture. And on top of that, this isolationist trend that is coming out of US public opinion, especially on the right, and all of this is playing into Capitol Hill. As Caroline mentioned, there was the initiative by Representative Matt Gaetz in March that he sponsored a concurrent resolution for the Biden administration to withdraw US forces from Syria in 6 months. And I think this is important to mention. First of all, it was not an actual piece of legislation with a concurrent resolution, more of a statement with no teeth, but it only failed by a 3-1 margin. And when considering the ramifications that my co-panelists have discussed are very large and very extensive, this 3-1 margin is concerning. And this isn't even the first attempt by Representative Gaetz to do this. A couple of weeks before this, in February, he attempted the same piece, but with a 2-week withdrawal timeline, which would even be more catastrophic. And the fact that this 3-1 ratio was improved after only expanding this timeline by a couple months is a cause for concern. And we even have seen a couple of months after President Trump's announcement of the repositioning of US troops in 2019, Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii also tried the same thing. And so it shows us a couple things. First of all, that Congress is adapted to current events, and also that it is adapted to these changing public opinion outtakes that are happening in the US. And with this Israel-Hamas conflict and everything that's coming out of it, there, like I mentioned earlier, it is the threat of escalation between the US and Iran going back to loops is a concern among the US public. And the idea of US forces being hurt and the kind of message that would send to people on Capitol Hill, to representatives and senators, is something that needs to be discussed. And as President Biden has kind of made his rhetoric that the US will support the Netanyahu government, whatever choices it takes in this conflict, this is just something that we have to pay attention to. And lastly, I think it's important to point out the rhetoric that is coming out of a lot of the Republican candidates for president that is a little concerning. And in the first 2 debates, we saw this isolationist trend kind of come into how candidates are talking about foreign policy and the fact that Ukraine is less of a focus, instead reallocating those funds to domestic conflicts like the southern border. But in this last debate, in light of recent events in Israel, we saw a lot of the candidates have very escalatory rhetoric about how the US should be engaging in Iran. And this, of course, brings about the conundrum of how the US can be escalatory with Iran and kind of push back against them. Representative Scott, who's now apparently not in the race anymore, will not be president at the next debate. He even used the words that the US needs to take the fight to Iran and its proxies and its militias. And it brings the question how the US can do that with also this idea of withdrawal, because of course withdrawal, as Colonel Haddings and I mentioned in the report, would only increase Iranian influence and make it heavier in the region. And so all of this to say that it's a very hot topic, and I think it's a cause for concern as public opinion continues to shift in this next year before the election.
So I want to end off before we entertain audience questions with a very simple but loaded question, which is what sorts of lessons learned should be incorporated? Jonathan, you mentioned, for example, further identifying and defining Operation Inherent Resolve's mission. What sorts of tweaks should be incorporated into the United States forward posture in the Middle East to ensure that these missions are more sustainable and that they can incorporate an understanding of these risks of withdrawal or the risks that could happen if the United States conducts either a partial or full scale?
Oh, the implications of withdrawal from Syria are going to create a power vacuum, but Syria will have let's just talk about the actors that are happening in Syria. There's actors, state or non-state actors. You have Syria, and the U.S. presence there is not authorized. It is a sovereign nation, so we are there illegally, according to Syria. In the United States, if there were the presence of Syrian troops, we would say in Texas, we would say that's illegal. Certainly, we have a reason to be there to fight ISIS and justify militarily. It is in our U.S. national security interest to be there, but it's an illegal occupation. Syria wants us out. Russia is their partner. They want us out. Turkey wants us out. Iran wants us out. They want us out so much so that the leaders of those four nations met in Tehran and said, hey, we're making a resolution. We want the U.S. out of Syria. This is a serious issue. There's also non-state actors. ISIS still remains present in Syria, and let's not forget about the 10,000 ISIS detainees that are held in Syrian forces. And you have these Iranian-backed militias that have been attacking U.S. troops throughout north and east Syria. So if we withdraw there will be a vacuum of bad actors who are going to go into the northeast Syria. They will gain more resources from oil. They can do things like free ISIS to reform battalion and brigade-sized groups to cause mayhem throughout Syria and potentially infiltrate into Iraq. And as Jonathan alluded to, we might be back there again trying to clean up the mess. There's also the U.S. reputation. How do we leave? What happens when we leave that could be impacted? And then on the Iraq side, right now, Iraq, we are trying to have strong diplomatic relations. Secretary Blinken has met with the Prime Minister. We are getting Iraq to make humanitarian assistance, or we have celebrated Iraq making humanitarian assistance for Gaza. We have investments there in gas and oil industry, and the U.S. wants to stay there. We have a bilateral relationship with a government that is struggling right now. The Speaker of the House in Iraq in the past 24 hours has been removed from his position. Several ministers have resigned. In the Kurdistan region, there's not a proper parliament. So the U.S. is hanging on to Iraq as Iraq is hanging on to itself. And a departure there will again create more of an opportunity, particularly for Iranian-backed groups that are already in places where ISIS once was, to operate unchecked and potentially have physical violent actions towards our partners in the region. So it is important that the U.S. thinks through these decisions, has strong policy statements and laws to back up whatever decisions that we make in the region, because American taxpayers and Americans, sons and daughters, both in the military, diplomatic corps, and thousands of contractors are on the line.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. And three lessons I'd like to highlight, and some will be a bit repetitive in my opening remarks, but first is accuracy of our assessments and wargaming essentially out what happens in the event of U.S. troop withdrawals. We clearly did not plan, we failed to plan for a worst case scenario in Afghanistan, and were woefully unprepared for that. And I mean, that was fundamental to the dramatic collapse of the Afghan government. Well, there were intelligence assessments or should I say, many policymakers and the intelligence community was putting a number of somewhere like 6 to 12 months on the Afghan government's ability to hold out. But there was also a school of thought that looked back to historical precedent to the 1989 to 92, when the Soviets continued to support the communist regime in Afghanistan, and for more than 3 years, Najibullah had held out because he had Soviet funding. It was when that funding was cut that Afghan government fell. So there was some thinking, if we continue to aid and assistance to this government, that they're going to be, right? It was really a failure to grapple with the larger picture. And I think if we had, if we'd been more honest with ourselves, we certainly could have foreseen it happen. Second, we can do more on security sector assistance reform. I'm echoing Jonathan's point. I was curious, I'm certainly not an expert on Iraq or Syria, so I was keen to hear, your assessments, and Miles' assessment of, what, how much my story, resonated for you, and how familiar does that sound and what you see in Iraq and Syrian forces. Third, the Special Immigrant Visa program, and we just had not put enough resources. We have not put enough resources into the SIV program for Afghans. We should be honest here that under Secretary of State Pompeo, it was all but stopped. I mean, it was slowed to a trickle, and that really created a backlog that then only continued in the early months of the Biden administration and left us with a nightmare scenario for people who had risked their lives and continued to, for our values and our vision. But then finally, I just want to comment that as Miles, should I tell you, son of pagans? The political, and as Carolyn echoed too, like the political dimensions of this. And I think of this all the time with the Afghanistan case, because there's a policy discussion, you can have a policy debate about what is right or wrong to best advance U.S. interests, but then there's a political element that many of us policy wonks don't often think about, and I think it's fair to say that there was a time when these decisions were less politicized in terms of U.S. domestic politics, and maybe it's since the Vietnam War that they've been more highly politicized, but it can be really disappointing to watch Congress debate these issues when we should be on the same team and we should be thinking about what are our U.S. strategic interests as a nation, and we should not be seeking political, cheap political points by embarrassing one administration or the other. And maybe that's inevitable, but I think this whole dynamic, this whole problem is partly a victim of the deep political polarization in our country today. It's not right, and we should be demanding better of our own leaders.
And just a quick point on political, I think it's some of the Afghans who we brought out include this group of women fighters, female tactical platoons, who fought with American conventional and special operation forces, trained, funded, advised by, fought side by side with. We brought them here to immigrate here, but now some of them could potentially be deported because their status of their immigration. So I think it's the Afghan Adjustment Act.
Yeah.
There's a piece of legislation called the Afghan Adjustment Act, where it seems like would be a no-brainer. Just everybody should pass this, take care of these heroes who fought with us to protect our troops, who we've welcomed here in the country, to give them an immigrant status carved out where they can stay and have a certainty of staying. But that can't be done, and you can even see support from the bipartisan side. Democratic candidate Marianne Williamson and her national security and veterans topics, she includes the Afghan Adjustment Act. But it can't be done because of this political intransigence where one side doesn't want the other side to get a victory, even if it's something they all would agree to on Twitter or even behind closed doors. But
Even serves our interests in the future by protecting our credibility and demonstrating to people who we're going to need to rely on in other contexts in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere around the world, and to demonstrate that we will hold our value.
100% on them to all of that. I work in a bipartisan think tank. I work the most bipartisan committee in Congress. And frankly, I'm of the belief that all of this partisanship is absolutely inimical to U.S. national security interests and is actually toxic to good policy outcomes. That said, the politics here are a real thing. They're unfortunate and they're difficult, but the more we can incentivize members to work across the aisle for the shared interest, will only serve us better. Specifically on where we should be going in terms of Iraq and Syria, there are a host of complications and problems. Obviously, the influence of Iran-backed groups is a complicating factor. I think there are all sorts of new interesting possibilities and ways we can perceive the region if we think of it more in the internationalized context of our national security strategy. The fact that Russia has significant strategic military presence in Syria how we might animate our partnerships and alliances in the region to think about our global objectives, creates all sorts of interesting opportunities. But putting that aside for a moment, going back to the first principles, we came back to the basis. What need to be accomplished to ensure the lasting of the. So a lot of the work that we did on the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, from fiscal years 20 through 23, was really focused on trying to extract a strategy from the Department of Defense that spoke about sustainable end states and what authorities would be needed to shift us from this emergency room medicine of OIR into something that would build lasting capability and capacity. It's an area the department has worked on a lot in terms of its own development with DSCA, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, to build programs that think about defense institutional reform and building sustainable outcomes, and not to build forces that simply resemble our own, but otherwise can be sustainable and functional in the context of what there is on the ground. Many lessons, of course, learned over 2 decades in Afghanistan, I'm sure, informing a lot of that work. So we actually force-fed the machine a little bit with authorities and funding for Iraq specifically in areas where the department could apply more sustainable types of security assistance and security cooperation that were otherwise not based in the emergency authorities that govern OIR. More of that, I think, is important. And of course, focusing then on the political end state, particularly in Syria, we need to be clear on. If we can't identify the political end state in Syria, and everything that we're doing will otherwise revert the moment that U.S. forces leave, and we don't have the means to achieve anything better, then we have to be realistic that what we are doing in Syria is a holding pattern to build up resiliency in Syria's neighbors, such that when we do leave Syria and ISIS reverts and comes back, we now have a functional containment strategy. Speaking just very sort of realistically, that's one course of action, perhaps most likely course of action, unless we want to think more holistically about outcomes in Syria. Ever so finally, on the issue of SIVs, yes, there's of course the political considerations and scary immigrants and all of those debates, but there's actually both a policy and a legislative problem here to confront too. A policy problem, obviously, the function of how SIVs are granted in U.S. government interagency processes are sporadic and not nearly big and developed enough or quick enough. The other issue here, too, from a policy perspective in terms of legislation, looking at differences between what we have done or could do for partners in Afghanistan and Iraq, going back to Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, is that these were not by, with, and through missions. These were ancillary individuals who were attached to us, who, by the nature of their work, working with us, were put in harm's way. The most recent operations in Iraq and Syria were by, with, and through. And so it's a very different group of individuals that we work with. I'm not sure that we should think about SIVs in the same way that we might have in the past, because is it our intention to otherwise take a large swath of the Kurdish population of Northeast Syria and resell them elsewhere in the world? Is that something that they would want? Anyone who is otherwise associated with the counter-ISIS campaign becomes someone who would then leave under this authority? I think the fact that we did this operation differently means we need to think about SIVs differently. And then furthermore, there's the fiscal problem of all this, which the Syrian Partner Protection Act, for all its good effort, doesn't address. And there's no easy solution to this. Is that ultimately the Congressional Budget Office scores every special immigrant visa as costing $125,000 in mandatory direct spending. Congressional rules require an offset of mandatory spending, so not spending of any given 1 year, but over time, that type of direct spending, which is much harder to find an offset for. At last blush, the Syrian Partner Protection Act included 4,000 visas. That's $500 million in mandatory spending. Ask any member what they would cut to provide for that, you'll get a terrified blank stare, right? It is a huge amount of money. So there are perhaps other things that could be done to try to apply cheat codes to otherwise make that, cost disappear. But that is what the assent process, and that is otherwise the thing that prevents this from becoming law. It's a huge point of order, and that no one can agree on how to fund such a massive.
Yeah, of course, and the panelists have again brought up great points, and since I'm last, I'm gonna emphasize a few of them. Mostly just the importance of preparing. Jonathan brought up some really good points about the need to figure out the budgeting behind this, kind of iron out some more details of the Syrian Partner Protection Act. And this is all stuff that Colonel Kagan and I and our groups feel that needs to be started, this conversation needs to be started now, and critical now, because it tends to happen that when the decision to withdraw is made, the first and only priority is getting Americans out, getting US forces, US citizens out, and these other things are less of a priority. And so in that realm, Kate brought up some really good points about the strategic, operational, tactical, and all of these levels, there needs to be more integration of all of these decisions in the preparation. And lastly, just to go back to this politicization point, one more nail in the coffin of this back and forth, this harping, it's going to cause a lot of problems, and it's held up things like the SIV program for Syrians, and it's only going to get worse as we head into this next election cycle. And so that's what makes this time more accurate and more important for Congress to look at this and try to find some kind of solution to certain aspects like protection of partners in Syria.
Excellent. So I'd like to open up the floor to audience questions, both in person and online. I've got 2 online already, but we'll start with in-person questions here in our New Lines office.
And if you could let us know your name and affiliation.
All right, perfect. We'll go to the 2 that we have online. At present, due to the recent drone attacks within Erbil province, there exists some concerns whether or not the Baghdad embassy and Erbil consulate shall eventually close if such attacks escalate. Do you believe that there is a high risk of that occurring? And anyone who would like to answer that?
The 55, maybe even higher, since we've been talking today, attacks on U.S. forces operating inside of Iraqi and Kurdish bases in the past couple of weeks is rather unprecedented since the beginning of our operations against ISIS in 2014-15. But the militias the Iranian-backed militias do understand that it is a hard red line if they are to attack diplomatic facilities. They could easily target the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. It's right next to a small military base. They can target the U.S. consulate in Erbil, both with accurate drones that they've been using or other types of attacks, but they don't. And they don't because as they're wanting to incrementally put pressure on Washington, they don't want to flip the switch and have Washington bring all the stunning and blessing all across Syria. And there's always a quiet conversation that's happening in the background in Iran, and it has its tentacles all throughout Iraq, from Basra all the way to Zaka in the north, knows that a return of tens of thousands of troops and making a battlefield in Iraq is not good for their long-term or short-term strategic interests, which include, of course, economic interests as well as cultural and security. So I think for the questioner that it is, if there is an attack, and of course they have their facilities in their crosshairs, it will be a strong indication of an escalation in Iran saying, bring it on, America, let's go all in.
No, I think that's right. I think something else to consider here is probably ever since Soleimani was taken from this world, largely it was assessed that he was the conductor and the orchestrator of all of these groups, and that is true. And they have had a tremendous amount of respect for him. But what may also have been lost is Iran's ability to pull back the reins on these groups that otherwise have a lot of their own indigenous incentives for trying to provoke conflict with the United States. These groups are seeking to increase hostilities. They would like to see the U.S. respond inside of Iraq so they can bring action in the Council of Representatives to try to force the US presence out, once again. They want to burnish their own credentials as, the leaders of the resistance. So there's a lot of political incentive among these groups within Iraq to draw the US into the fight. And so far, President Biden has really walked that line of trying to defend US forces while not give up the ball strategically and put us into a worse situation that either gets us close to getting thrown out or escalates the conflict, which is not serve US strategic purpose. So that's a hard act to balance. But understanding that these groups do have their own incentives and agenda in attacking the US, and Iran may not have 100% total positive control of these activities at this point. So we should be cognizant of that as well.
Absolutely, especially with some of these networks that have, of course, acted at the direction of Tehran, but also there have been many strikes where they were reported to be, of course, independently conducted. I have another question online, but just wanted to refer back to our in-person audience if there are any questions.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Sina Mohammed from Syrian Democratic Council. Thank you so much for all the ideas that all the panelists discuss about. I would like to say something now. In the northeast Syria, the presence of the American air is very different from what's going on in Afghanistan, of course. We have a very few troops there, which are maybe 1,000 or 900, and they are not entering the fighting. The people who is fighting there are the SDF. They are fighting. They have been trained and equipped from the United States. I would like to thank them. But the people who is fighting and paying the price, and we have paid more than 12,000 of our fighters there in fighting ISIS. So leaving them now alone without having any political solution for Syrian crisis, I don't think it will be a catastrophe actually if they leave now. So for that, even the Syrian Democratic Forces and the autonomous administration there, they don't want, expect that the United States stay there for a long time. We know that. But we want to see the future of Syria now. It should not be in a catastrophe. For instance, I think mentioned that Russia is there. They are expecting if the vacuum there will be, Russia will fill the vacuum. And the Iranian militia are there now. We are seeing what's going on there in the region. So what we need there, how can we protect the people there? By supporting them in fighting. Still ISIS are there. We don't, expect ISIS has done. Of course, military, we defeated ISIS, but the ideology of ISIS is still there, exists. So how can we end? Because the presence of the East group, they say it is only for fighting ISIS. But it seems that ISIS is still there. It's not finished. The ideology of ISIS is there, and we are seeing it is now re-emerging again. 12,000 of the ISIS fighters in the presence. In our whole camp, we have 50,000 of their families. So how can we manage all this problem in the northeast Syria if the United States withdraw from there? What will be the picture? Thank you so much.
We're honored to have Mohammed from the Syrian Democratic Council with us here in the room today. The other representatives here in Washington. There's a report that came out earlier today from the Washington Institute. My friend Vladimir Van Wildenberg published it, and it talks about the Syrian Democratic Forces and their role in Deir ez-Zor province in the eastern south part of Syria, mostly Arab area, and how the Syrian Democratic Forces who America has supported in the fight against ISIS now are having to protect American troops and civilian population from Iranian-backed militias. They've had direct confrontations and clashes. Concurrently, in the areas closer to the north central or northwest Raqqa, there have been Turkish-backed militias who are putting pressure on the SDF, all as a uptick after October 7th in Israel and Gaza. So the question for Washington lawmakers and for the President of the United States is to define a policy in Syria and to have some goals. Right now, it's just keep the status quo. But it's not free. Jonathan knows this, as there may be concerns about spending $100,000 to bring somebody here in the Immigration Visa program. Right now, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in North and East Syria, in some instances to fund holding ISIS detainees in makeshift prison camps, where Americans are paying this cost, and there are more than 2,000 ISIS fighters from foreign nations who are also being held in these same camps. So this really is very much America's issue to deal with, even though we would say for the global coalition, it's an international problem with international solution. As you've met with leaders of the Pentagon and State Department and White House, I think probably over these years, there's not been a yes or no answer, and probably because America has not set an agenda and there's no laws, authorization of use of military force, nor specific appropriation line related to our objectives in Syria. So it's nebulous. We don't know what will happen. But the best we can do is plan for what happens next. An immigration program is a small part of that, though clearly most of the SDF fighters would not be interested in coming to America, but we've seen their family members attacked in recent weeks. We've seen business leaders attacked for their affiliations with Americans. And these conversations need to happen all across America too, as the world looks at the region and doing what's right for our partners there. 12,000 who were martyred against ISIS, 20,000 wounded, and each day there are people on the front lines of these bases willing to face death to protect Americans.
We've got another
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
But Sam is also a representative of SDC here in Washington. You guys have spoken about the political gestures, like that the US could send, like what happened in Afghanistan, for example. And we also have a gesture or a sign, as SDC and autonomous region. We are not part of the political process in Geneva that is through the UN. So it's very important for us as we think about possible, as my colleague Sinem said, we know the US is not there forever. So if they leave one day and we are not part of a political process, there is no political solution. How have we gained out of the sacrifices we have made? Not just the people we have lost, but also the infrastructure, our infrastructure that's been destroyed, which is really, it's an infrastructure for the Syrian people. Like Turkey, while the Gaza-Israeli infighting going on, has been attacking us and no attention is being given to us. And Turkey has destroyed about 80% of our infrastructure. And then we are not part of the political solution. And we know the US is going to leave one day. Is this a promising situation? And is this a situation where the US in the future could point to and say, we are useful and helpful overseas? To anybody who would like to answer this question. What can we do to be part of a political solution?
I'll just say briefly, I think you're putting your finger on also a fundamental weakness that was inherent in the Afghanistan, in the U.S. experience in Afghanistan and in the experience of the Republic, right? Because there was always a tension between sovereignty, Afghan sovereignty, and U.S. strategic interests. And while the Afghan governments have been dependent on foreign aid for many decades, back to even the 19th century, those dynamics were playing out during the war of 2001 to 2021, such that Afghan presidents never really controlled as my colleague DePauli pointed out in the hearing yesterday, never really had the power to control politics and policy at the level that that would have reflected true sovereignty, right? So I'm not sure. I don't have any easy answer, to that tension, but it was a reason that Afghan leadership and ownership wasn't wasn't realized, because at the end of the day, the U.S. was in the country to fight the war on terror, and we had many other objectives that were aligned with our Afghan partners. But sometimes those objectives took a second, were trumped by our security interests, right? So how do we, United States, thread that needle in these contexts? I think it's a big question.
And a short point about America's public view things. If Russia attacks a school in Ukraine, America says it's a war crime. If Turkey attacks a school in Syria, America is silent. So if Israel attacks a school in Gaza, America says it's justified because there's terrorists hiding. So you see, all lives matter is what America says, but not really. And ultimately, the United States should live by its principles. And whether we take action to prevent something, we should still have the principles of how we feel about military actions around. Stick to those core values.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, obviously, and I spent most of my time working on defense issues. I think between defense and state, there's this cultural difference, right? Defense Department lays down a mission objective, then come hell or high water, they're going to take it, right? And we'll put resources and then material behind that mission. The State Department, I think, ultimately, for a host of reasons that I can't necessarily begin to explain, culturally, just doesn't think about its role in the same way. I would assess that to unlock the political problem of Northeast Syria, we must begin to address some of the tectonic fissures underneath. Ankara views Kurdish autonomy in the Northeast as a threat to itself. There has been perennial war and conflict between Turkey and the PKK, and those that have been associated with the PKK, either fairly or unfairly. And until either Washington directly or perhaps more effectively indirectly works to restore a ceasefire and calm in between Turkey and Kurds, none of the other things have space to mature. So I don't necessarily know if the U.S. is the appropriate intermediary at this point. Certainly, I don't know if we'd be viewed that way by Ankara, but certainly there are partners in the world who could provide a platform to begin that negotiations process. And when you speak to our Turkish friends about the issue of Kurds and PKK, they're insanely hostile. But at the same time, the truth is, it was just a few years ago that a ceasefire did exist. So we're not talking about things that are fanciful or outside the realm of reality. These things have been achieved and they can be achieved again. And I think that is the pathway that needs to begin to enable a political solution to take hold, to create the space for a political solution to even become visible.
Really excellent question from one of our online participants. And this is a question asking us to forecast what happens to other allied and partner forces operating alongside U.S. forces if the United States were to conduct a full-scale withdrawal, both in Iraq and in Northeast Syria. Gaming out, what do we foresee happening and forecast happening with these partner forces, for example, the United Kingdom and other forces?
I'll just say, in recent weeks, we've seen statements by leaders in Germany and France that they're committed to having forces in the region. We've had probably a month ago or so, a French commando who was killed in a raid in north central Iraq against ISIS. So the partners in the global coalition, military partners, remain committed to the mission, but the backbone of the operation is the United States. It's a U.S.-led coalition that most of the funding and logistics on the bases is coordinated by the United States because we're good at that. Our logistics system, our transportation command, we can move equipment, supplies, people, we can feed people around the world and fuel them around. So my sense is that there would be limited security cooperation that happens in Kurdistan region. Probably in federal Iraq, you would see the small contingent of NATO advisors probably scale down even further or leave without a deployment of NATO security forces to protect that mission.
Well, with that, do we have any other questions from the audience? No? Excellent. I want to thank everyone today for attending this project launch and this excellent panel discussion. We greatly enjoyed this very robust discussion incorporating lessons learned and also forecasting the security implications for potential withdrawal processes throughout the Middle East. I'd really like to thank our panelists for joining us today. For those who are here in Washington, coming all the way out to Massachusetts Avenue, as well as for those who are traveling from New York. Thank you very much. This is a project that has been in the works for months, if not years. So please do stay with us and check out our work on the New Lines Institute website. You can find us at the Post-Withdrawal Security Landscape Project, where we will be producing reports, producing articles, podcasts, and other sorts of products that do address these very important and prominent questions, particularly amidst a series of challenges that are emerging in the region. Thank you very much and take care. And for those here, we do have a catered lunch available. So please stick with us if you're hungry. Thank you so much. You guys, let's